To continue my series about the death of atheism, I wanted to talk to you today about the birth of life. It seems that most atheists love talking evolution, but evolution is merely the cherry on top. You know, when you make a cake and you got frosting on the cake, and then you have a little whipped cream on the frosting, and then for decoration you put a little cherry on top. Well, that's the theory of evolution. It doesn't stand on its own. It has to have a foundation. It has to have like 15 or 20 other theories only to bring it to the point where you can actually have evolution. So my goal is to help you see that it's not just improbable that we were created without God, but that it is scientifically impossible. Because my claim is not only that you do not have a cherry on top, you don't even have cream, frosting, cake, table, or a floor for the table to stand on, or ground for the floor to be on. Atheism is dead in the water. Like I said, not improbable, but scientifically impossible. Now, some might say you can never prove or disprove God, and that is true for the most part. However, you're not supposed to. Because all you really have to do is prove that it is scientifically not possible for life as it is to come about in a natural, scientific, mathematical way. And, by default, if it is impossible for this world as it is today to come about naturally, well, there has to be a supernatural origin, hence a creator, which is God. So we've already talked about how the formation of stars is practically impossible, scientifically impossible in a naturalistic way, and that is a whole message all to itself that you're more than welcome to listen to. But today we are going to talk about the formation of life. As the title of the message says, the death of the first life who never lived. And I'm gonna show you how it is so simple to put an end to this theoretical process called abiogenesis. A process that theoretically, allegedly, was responsible for the formation of the first living organism. Now, do not be confused and do not be deceived. Just because it has a fancy name doesn't make it true. And I'm going to prove it to you very clearly using strict logic, mathematical probability, and observational science to show you that it is not just improbable, but impossible for life to come from nothing. Now remember, the atheistic claim states that there is no God, and God, by its definition here, is a creator, an intelligent designer, all-powerful, all-knowledgeable, immense intelligence that designed the universe as it is. He put forth the laws of logic and physics and math, designed the chemicals and how they interact with one another. He put forth processes and events. He's the one that pushed the ball, got it rolling. In atheism, there is no such thing. Atheism relies solely on chance, randomity, and time. No intelligence involved, no intervention by any being, because there is nothing. Life just kinda came about on its own through chemical evolution, cosmic evolution, biological evolution, etc., without any intervention, design, purpose, or intelligence. Just so that we're clear on what we're talking about. This is what atheism believes. There is no creator. Everything that is was created by chance, randomly. No design, no intelligence. Okay? Making sure that you understand so that you can see later how ridiculous this claim is once we dive a little deeper and actually expose the lies of this abiogenesis theoretical process that is impossible scientifically. So, how did life begin? Well, according to this theory, life began in somewhat of a hot spring or a hypothermal vent. Some sort of a water source that warmed up, and with this newfound heat, basic molecules started appearing. And through different processes that we are unsure of, they somehow became complex molecules, who then started bonding together through different chemical reactions and then somehow formed the first DNA strand, or if you will, the first RNA strand. We don't really know which came first, RNA, which is the singular line, a sequence of genetic letters. It is a genetic code composed of building blocks called nucleotides. Nucleotides are basically characters. They are commonly known in the letters of A, T, C, and G. And when you form a sequence of them, they contain the genetic information necessary for the creation of the organism. So, they say that in this hot spring type of arena, these molecules just kind of came about and they bonded together and randomly assembled themselves in a sequence to contain valuable, applicable information for the creation of the first living organism. And that's how life began. Now, that is not science, okay? That is science fiction. First and foremost, we have never observed such a thing, and we can never observe it for various reasons I'll explain later, but just think about this process for a moment. This is like a Frankensteinian thing. You're telling me that in a hot pond, molecules just kind of appeared and became more complex and came together. So let's just look at the claims here and use what we actually know from observational science. See, there is a big difference between historical science and observational science. Observational science is something that is replicable, testable, something you can conduct in a lab and repeat the same results over and over again in multiple different areas, conducted by multiple different people. It's the way we send rockets to space and the way we use telecommunication and Wi-Fi. It's observational, it's practical. Historical is something that is unreplicatable, something that we've never seen, something that we cannot repeat. It's just a bunch of theoretical, we look at it now and it kind of looks like this might have happened. But there's no proof and it never can be proven, and that's the key here. You can never repeat it. Because even if you were able to somehow repeat biogenesis in a lab, well, guess what? It wouldn't be a biogenesis because you're doing it. Hence, you've already put in the influence of an intelligent being into this process. So while trying to prove that life can come on its own, you'd actually be doing more service to the believer in God by showing that life can only come by the interference of an intelligent being. So that's historical science for you. So let's actually break down this process, abiogenesis. Now, to create a living organism, the simplest organism that ever was. Well, today we know that the simplest organism that is a single-cell organism called Mycoplasma genitalium. It is a single-cell organism that exist on its own. It's not a parasite. It is completely whole and it is able to survive on its own. And that's important because for any first living organism, it has to be able to survive on its own, not be a parasite, because a parasite needs a host. It needs another living being in order for him to kind of get on top of him and leech on to what he has. But we're looking here for the first living organism that can survive on its own. And that is the simplest life form that we know of. Simple sounds simple, right? But consider the fact that this simple, tiny, single-cell life form has in its genetic code over 480 different genomes, and genomes would be like the paragraphs, the different sections within the big picture, right? Like when you're coding a software, you have different portions of the program. Those would be the genomes, and then you have the whole system as a whole. That would be the entire genetic code. So this simple living organism, Mycoplasma genitalium, has 480 genomes, and listen to this, composed of 580,000 pairs of nucleotides. 580,000 pairs of nucleotides. That's over 500,000 nucleotides in order to compose those 480 genes in order for this living being to exist, to be able to live, to survive. Do you understand how crazy it is? But let's give you a break. Let's say that the first living organism was much simpler than this Mycoplasma genitalium, even though we have no evidence of that. But let's cut it in half. Let's say it only had 200 genes and only 250,000 nucleotides. Now surely the Mycoplasma genitalium has a DNA strand which is composed of a double sequence. You have the one sequence which by itself is called RNA, but then you have the other sequence and they bind together by chemical bonds to make it stable. That's what's called the DNA, so you actually need double the amount of nucleotides because each is a pair. So if you have 250,000 pairs, that's 500,000 nucleotides. But let's say it was only an RNA strand to give you some slack, give you some grace on this. 250,000 nucleotides. Do you know the odds of a sequence of 250,000 characters forming randomly on its own, containing the most complex information that to this very day human beings have not even been able to completely decipher or replicate? You know, genetic code is not mumbo jumbo. It's not just gibberish letters bound together like feathers in a pillow. It is written in a direct sequence to contain knowledge, to contain applicable information. Think about a software, as I've mentioned before. When you're writing code on your computer, whatever you're using, any kind of language, it has to be precise. If you're just typing nonsense, it would not compile. It would not run. It would just crash and give you all kind of errors. You have to have valid information. Now you can get away with some typos maybe, but if you forget a bracket, the whole thing is going to collapse, right? So this genetic code, and again, we're talking about the first living organism that ever existed. There is no evolution here. It cannot be gradual over time, and there's no room for mutations because mutations too happen over successive generations from one to another as they multiply. But we're talking about the first living organism that ever existed, and it already needed to have this valid sequence that would come about like that, from nothing to something, in a perfect consecutive order to contain all of this complex information to form things like ribosomes, like cell wall, like mitochondria, like cytoplasm, like the nucleus. It needed to contain information, how to convert matter into energy for the cell to continue living. It needed to contain information, most importantly, on how to multiply and duplicate itself so that there can even be a continuum of life. Think about this for a moment. If this first living organism just popped into existence and did not already know how to duplicate itself, it would just die off and there would be nothing. So for the very get-go, it needed to already be born with the knowledge on how to self-duplicate, replicate, and separate itself from itself so that both can live, hence multiplying and expanding. And that of course means having the genetic code to do so. Organisms don't really know anything. They just store up information in their genetic code, and then you interpret that code by whatever mechanism and put it to action. That's a big claim, especially considering the fact that, like I said, you're gonna need 250,000 letters forming in the right sequence, and this all happens in a free radical wild west type of a environment. Because there is no living organism yet. There's no cell wall to guard you from the outside influences. This is all happening allegedly in a hot spring, where nucleotides just kind of form randomly without any supervision, without any influence, without any intelligent design or control. They're just forming and bouncing into each other and just boom, 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 gluing together to form a random sequence. Well, have you ever just sat randomly on your keyboard, shaking your butt left and right, and formed a sequence of 250,000 consecutive characters that actually contained information to create one of life's most sophisticated machine, a living organism? Have you ever played Scrabble and you took that little bag with all the letters and you just shook it above the table, all the letters fell out in a perfect, complete order to fill the entire Scrabble board with words that all line up with each other to contain information that actually would make sense? No. And even that wouldn't be as difficult as it would have been for this alleged first genetic code to appear. So think about this for a moment, because, like I said, you gotta have this valid sequence of letters, but if letters can just randomly come and attach to one another, what keeps them from separating from one another and replacing what has already been set? Have you ever tried to write by sprinkling sand outside? You got sand and you're dripping sand grains to write something, and there's wind coming in. And by the time you get to the fourth letter, the first one already been wiped out by the wind. Or actually writing in the sand by the beach with your finger, carving in the sand next to the waters. You write in 2 sentences and the first one is already gone because the waters from the sea just came in and washed it away. It's unsustainable. It's like filling a bucket with water that has a hole in it and you're losing twice the amount of water you put in every second. It's impossible. You're losing more information than you ever could gain it. Because the odds are for what already is to be destroyed than for what is not to get created in the proper order. And you gotta put here a sequence of 250,000 nucleotides for this thing to even have the complete compact information to be able to make itself. The odds here are zero. It's not just improbable, it's impossible, because you have a higher probability of losing the information you've already gained by the time you gain the rest of the information. Not to mention that nucleotides on their own, when not actually bound up together to form the DNA molecule, they don't live very long. In particular, in this type of a hot spring environment with high temperatures that could allow for this synthesis to happen, they could last for maybe up to 10 days. That's not a long time considering you have to form this sequence within that time frame. You do not have billions of years to come up with it. Within a week, give or take, this whole sequence has to appear with all of its leaks, all of these random spontaneous actions and random creation of nucleotides, if they could even come about in this wild west type of environment. And then of course they have to be in proximity to one another to even come and get attached to one another in a chemical bond. That is not so simple, and neither is the information simple. It's not just sounds, abagada. This is incredibly complex information, not just gibberish, that these nucleotides have to line up in order to create. This is a very sophisticated mathematical formula, much more sophisticated than Einstein's theory of relativity. This is a sequence of information of 250,000 letters that forms the first living organism that can survive, sustain itself, and duplicate. And where do the nucleotides come from? Just random chemicals born out of nothing in this primordial soup? You gotta have 250,000 of them at least, because remember, not everyone is gonna get attached, and some of them are gonna be destroyed and washed away before the construction is complete, so you really gotta have like 500,000 or more of those. How do they even come about? Do you know how complex it is to form a nucleotide, especially when it's all random? There's nobody creating this thing? Now, in our body, the cells themselves form these nucleotides. They gather the different resources within the cell, and they form nucleotides into the building blocks for the DNA and RNA molecules. But out and about, there is nobody producing this thing. It's all random. It is impossible. But let's, for the sake of argument, give you some slack and say it is not impossible, only improbable. Despite the odds being like 1 to 10 in the power of 600, as some of the AI calculators would have it, odds that are absolutely astronomical and are impossible in the real world, that would be equivalent to grabbing a single specific atom in the vastness of the universe on the first try, blindfolded. That is how impossible it really is. But even if there is a chance for it to happen, even if there is a possibility, that's not enough. Just because there's a chance for something to happen doesn't make it happen. A dice has a chance of 1 to 6 to land on every specific side, but it doesn't land on any side unless somebody rolls the dice. So either way, something has to happen for something to happen. Chance is not enough. Somebody has to be the force. There has to be some sort of a why, a reason, a decision. Why would it even exist? Why would nucleotides even form? Why would there be chemicals together? Why would they line up in the way that they do? Why would they form chemical bonds to make information? Atheism can never answer that question because in the atheistic worldview, there is no why. It's all just random, chance, and deep time. But let's say that you were somehow able to create this sequence of 500,000, 250,000 nucleotides. Well, have you ever seen a recipe bake itself? You got a recipe, 2 cups flour and, 1 cup sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 eggs, a little baking powder, a little maple, a little vanilla extract. Now what? So you got a recipe. It's not gonna bake itself. You have to have somebody or something, some sort of a outside influence that is able not only to understand the information, right? You got to be able to understand and decipher what is written. You also have to have the ability and the resources to do something about it. In other words, you need a baker, someone who can look at the ingredients, have the ingredients, and actually do the work into putting them together and baking the cake. So what good is all of this genetic code if there's nothing to do something about it? And obviously there is nothing, because the organism is not yet in existence. You've just randomly formed its DNA code. It's not alive yet. It's not conscious, and how would it even know what it's looking at? You gotta have something that already exists outside of the organism to knit together the organism. And evolution is not existent yet. There is no evolution here because life has not yet begun. This is the very foundation of formation of life, allegedly. So not only the code itself is impossible to form on its own, even if it did form, there is no cell wall, there is nothing to protect it from breaking apart, and there is nothing in the cell that could actually synthesize it, put it together, and create life out of it. Because the ribosomes and other proteins that are supposed to decipher DNA and replicate it, well, guess what? The information for their creation is written inside of that DNA code. But there is nothing alive yet to study that DNA code in order to create the ribosomes who can decipher the DNA code. It's a catch-22. It can never occur. It just is not possible. And remember, this is just one part of the equation. This is the whipped cream, right? If evolution is the cherry on top, the formation of life is the whipped cream. We still have to deal with the cake, the table, the floor, the soil, and each one of them is more impossible than the other. And for atheism to work, you obviously need all of them to work. Because it is enough that one thing is impossible to prove the whole thing as impossible and prove to you why you need the Lord. You're straight up rebellious. There's no other excuse. It is rebellion and the hatred of God. Because like I said in the beginning of the message, it is enough to prove it is impossible for this life, this earth, this cosmos to exist naturally in order to prove the necessity of a supernatural creator, which is the Lord. So just humble yourself. Just repent. Just accept His love, accept His grace. Just do what is just and right. It's not that complicated. Acknowledge your guilt. Acknowledge your sin. Acknowledge your rebellion. Submit unto Him. And do what's right.